I study nutrition in the first 1,000 days, so that's from conception through to 2 years of age. And I study this period because it's the most rapid period of growth and development for children, and it also has the potential to have the most long-lasting effects for health outcomes later in life. It could be dietary intake. So we know that like food intake patterns in early life can influence later in life. For example, if you force an infant to finish a bottle, for example, in early life, 6 years down the line, they're more likely to clean their plates, which isn't always a great outcome because we want children to develop, hunger and satiety cues to influence when they start and stop eating, rather than just mindlessly eating whatever food is in front of them. So it could have an impact on that sort of behavior, but also potentially disease outcomes. So micronutrient deficiencies, malnutrition, obesity, things like that. I'm actually continuing in two different veins. So I'm interested in infant feeding and specifically breastfeeding. And I'm interested in the how and the what. And so I'm looking at the what of breast milk with research continuing in Cambodia on thiamine. And so I'm investigating mums' thiamine intake and how that influences the thiamine concentrations of their breast milk and the thiamine status of their babies. I'm also looking at the how of infant feeding. So in Nova Scotia, I'm starting a study to look at responsive feeding among mums who are both breastfeeding and feeding human milk from bottles to look at, are they practicing the same sorts of feeding behaviors for bottle feeding and breastfeeding of human milk? So thiamine is vitamin B1. It's an essential micronutrient. So we need thiamine full stop to be able to grow and survive. In Canada, thiamine is not a big deal because we know that everyone gets thiamine in their everyday diet through eating breakfast cereal or whole wheat bread or pork. But in certain regions of the world, thiamine intake is quite low. And an example of that comes from Southeast Asia. I work in Cambodia where the main dietary staple is white polished rice. And rice is a great source of carbohydrates, but there's really nothing else in white polished rice. And so when it makes up 60 to 70% of the diet, then there's really not much room to get these essential nutrients. And in the case of Cambodia, mums who are eating white polished rice are not taking in thiamine. They're not producing thiamine in their breast milk, and then when the babies drink their breast milk, they're not getting thiamine, which puts them at risk of developing a disease called beriberi. And beriberi can be fatal. And unfortunately, by the time the infants present with the symptoms of beriberi, if they're not treated within a few hours, they will die. So it has quite serious outcomes, even though it's a completely preventable disease that we've eradicated really nearly everywhere else in the world, except for pockets in regions, especially where white rice is consumed. This is an interesting question that I've been more interested in lately. So breastfeeding is the optimal means of feeding an infant, especially for the first 6 months of life. So Health Canada actually recommends that all babies are breastfed exclusively with no water, no other foods for the first 6 months. When you think about breastfeeding, you think of a baby at the breast. But more and more, especially today in Canada, where breastfeeding, especially in public, is stigmatized, more and more women are pumping their human milk and feeding that breast milk from a bottle. And so we've always equated human milk in a bottle and human milk from the breast, but are they the same? We know that that human milk, if it's been pumped, comes out, goes into the freezer, goes into the fridge, is heated up, and so there might be degradation of different components of that milk. But what I'm more interested in is how that milk is being fed to a baby, because typically caregivers will look at the milk that's left in the bottle and say, oh, there's only half an ounce left, just finish up, even if the baby's pushing the bottle out of their mouth. Whereas if you're breastfeeding and the baby pops off the breast, you'll say, okay, I don't know how much is left, so you're finished. And so breastfeeding is a really great path to what we call responsive feeding, or watching the infant's cues to determine when they're hungry and when they're full. And if we listen to those early hunger and satiety cues of when you're hungry and when you're full, then that baby is more likely to go on and keep those hunger and satiety cues moving forward. And this is of particular interest because we see more and more children are mindlessly eating, more and more adults stress eat, binge eat. And so if we can set infants on the right path of responsive feeding and listening to their bodies and understanding their bodies, then they'll have this innate ability carried through hopefully into adulthood.